Hey all, welcome to the 2012 Wright Men Tour of Mayhem. This year we decided to take a little trip down the west coast of Canada and part of the US here. Now, some of you may be wondering why we didn't do the Southwest US tour like we had planned the year before, and simply that was just too big of a trip. We didn't have time to do it here in 2012, so we decided to do a nice trip, head out to Vancouver Island, take Highway 1 down the west coast. So why call this the Neverending Tour? Well, that's an explanation I think I'm going to leave till the end of the video. Enjoy. You may notice a couple of changes this year. I had put some nice new hard bags on my bike that I'd ordered from a company in Japan called Tsukiyu. They're great bags. If you ever need bags, look them up. You'll also notice that my dad had sold his 2006 Kawasaki 900 and he was now riding a 2012 Kawasaki Nomad. It's about twice the size, much bigger bike, great for touring. Beautiful bike. If you ever get a chance to ride the Duffy Lake Road in BC, it's Highway 99 and runs from Cache Creek down to Vancouver through Whistler. This road was made for motorcycles. It's got lots of twists and turns, the pavement is in good shape, at least it was when I went on it, and the scenery is wonderful. It's a great road. If you get a chance to ride it, get out on it. After traveling down Duffy Lake Road, we had made it to Vancouver. Now it was time to catch the ferry over to the island where we would continue our trip. These ferries are great. They're very well equipped. The trip is smooth because the entire area is protected by the mainland and the island, so there's no big waves to worry about. No seasickness from either of us, fortunately. We stayed in Nanaimo that night as we'd gotten to the island late in the afternoon. This allowed us to get up early the next morning and have the entire day to explore the island before catching a ferry into the US. Tofino is a really great place to visit. If you like seafood, you'll find some of the freshest there is around on this island. It's great. However, it was time to go. We had to head south down to Victoria in order to catch a ferry across into the US to continue our trip through Washington State and down the coast. As we began our trip on the ferry, this sailboat had pulled up alongside the ferry and serenaded us with some polka music. It felt pretty special as I've never had a send-off like that before. This ferry trip took us across the Salish Sea, which is actually open to the ocean. So we experienced quite a bit more of the boat rocking, waves, and stuff like that. Nothing too violent, nothing that made us sick, but definitely not as smooth as the first trip across to the island. We arrived in Port Angeles after dark, so we just found ourselves a hotel room and crashed for the night so that we could get an early start for our tour around Olympia National Forest in the morning. After working our way around Olympia National Forest, we had finally got onto Highway 101, which goes right down the coast of Washington, Oregon, and into California. Riding along the ocean was really neat. Of course, being people from the prairies, this isn't something we get to do every day. One thing we did notice was that the temperature was very cool. The oceans obviously regulate the temperature far more than it does inland, but we actually had to wear our heated gear. We found it very cool. After a long day of riding and sightseeing, we ended our day in Astoria, Oregon. This is basically where the Columbia River hits the Pacific Ocean. We had a hotel that had a view of the waterfront, which was really neat because they had all of these great big ocean-going vessels that we could see. We weren't used to this, as again, being from the prairies, the biggest thing we had seen was probably a fishing boat. When you're on a bike trip, sometimes you run across little gems that you don't anticipate, such as this area here. This is the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area. We didn't plan on it, but we kind of stumbled across it, and it was a really neat area. It's a place where a lot of people come out with their ATVs and dune buggies, and it was beautiful. The one thing after pulling over on the side of the road is these big bikes do not handle in sand. It's very difficult to ride these things. Anybody who's ridden a motorbike like these knows you don't ride them in sand. From here we turned inland and eventually ended our day at Eugene, Oregon. Another good part about all these bike trips is you always meet some of the most interesting people. At one of our gas stops in Eugene, this old lady had come over to us and started talking to us. She must have been well into her 80s, but still had all her faculties and still mobile. She asked us about our bikes, and we of course asked her questions in return, and we asked her if she'd ever ridden. And she said that her and her husband used to ride a Goldwing all over the United States before he'd passed away a couple years before. It's really neat. You never expected to see it from this little old lady. As with many of our bike trips, we had to start today on the interstate. It was more or less a travel day. We headed up the I-5, and basically our goal today was to see Mt St Helens. We went and saw that, got back on the I-5, and continued up through Seattle. We unfortunately hit Seattle right around rush hour, so we actually came to a dead stop on the interstate. Once we worked our way around it, we spent the night in Everett, Washington. The North Cascades Highway in Washington State is definitely worth the time if you have it. It's one of the most scenic highways there is, and you hit some pretty high elevations. As you can see, we were probably above the snow line, and this was in August. Up until this point, the trip had been a lot of fun and everything was going really well. Unfortunately, on August 14th, this is where everything went off the rails. Before we continue on, I want to warn you that the rest of this video can contain some graphic content, so if you're easily disturbed, you should stop watching here. If you choose to stop watching here, thank you for taking the journey with me. Happy trails. We had crossed the border back into Canada at a place called Laurier, and it's right near Christina Lake, BC, which is a resort area. Our ultimate goal for the day was to get to New Denver, BC, where we would stay for the night. Unfortunately, we never made it. On Highway 3A, at a place called Shore Acres, the highway coming the opposite direction opens up into a passing lane. Traffic had been piled up behind a couple logging trucks, and a guy was in a hurry to get around him and pulled out and hammered on it and lost control of his SUV. He swung into my lane, he missed me, went back into his lane, swung back into our lane. He never hit Dad, but he forced him off the road. Dad was catapulted off his bike back onto the highway. The impact from the crash killed him instantly, although we didn't know it at the time. Some people stopped to help, and we did CPR on Dad until the ambulance arrived. They took us to Nelson, and in the emergency room, the doctors declared him dead. This is the last picture Dad took of me. This is at a roadside stop on the North Cascades Highway in Washington. And this here is the very last picture my father ever took. This is the very last picture I was ever able to take of my father. If you watch the 2010 Sturgis edition of the Wright Men Tour of Mayhem, you'll remember that I mentioned in there that I only had 2 good pictures of me and my father. Both of them were taken in Sturgis. During this trip, I had planned on trying to get a picture of us together every year that we went. I was going to do it when we got home so that I had somebody to hold the camera rather than trying to take a selfie. Unfortunately, that tradition never came to be. So now to answer the question we had at the beginning of the video, why call it the Neverending Tour? Well, that's easy. We never finished it, and there's not a day goes by that I don't relive that accident, so it never ends. If you've watched the video this far, I want to thank you for sharing this experience with me.